We're going to talk now about the Cold War, which refers to the decades following World War II, where we see the ideas of democracy versus communism, as represented by the United States and Britain on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other, where we see us um, dividing. We each have different ideas, different governments, and so forth. And it's going to result in this long period of mutual fear and mistrust. So here are your terms. Go ahead and write them down. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. In August 1945, the war in the Pacific ended. World War II was over. There was euphoria and hope in terms of building a new world. Fascism was dead. While the Allies celebrated victory, though, the appalling costs of the war began to emerge. The costs of the war in both human and material losses were huge. With the old European powers exhausted, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as dominant new superpowers. Their different political systems and their differing goals in Europe helped bring about the Cold War. So, what were the legacies of World War II in terms of destruction and damage? More than 50 million people died, nearly one half of them civilians. Millions more were disabled or wounded. There was mass economic and material destruction, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Railroads, towns, factories were damaged and in some cases destroyed. There was the impact of the war on human perceptions. The scope of this war just defied human understanding. For example, you've got these episodes of industrial mass killing. You've got the Holocaust, the Blitz, firebombing of German cities, the atom bombs. These things seriously question the belief in man's goodness and progress. The belief that man is inherently good could not be reconciled with the Holocaust and other episodes of deliberate mass killing. World War II reinforced the idea that civilization is fragile. The result was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Britain as well. It was communism against the Western democracies. So what was the Cold War? It lasted from 1945 to 1991, and it was a struggle between the two sides. The USSR, representing their form of communism, and Great Britain and the United States, representing democracy. It was not a war fought on the battlefield, but one of differing economic, political, and ideological beliefs. It resulted in mutual fear, tension, and misunderstanding. The Cold War shaped international relations, and it had a profound impact on Western civilization. The Cold War remained cold, meaning they're not actually out there on the battlefield fighting in a major war. So what contributed to the Cold War? What leads to it? Well, you have to go back to World War I. Western democracies expressed opposition and hostility when Lenin took Russia out of World War I. Then we have the Russian Civil War. Americans, the British, the French all intervened against the Bolsheviks. In the 30s, Stalin opposed appeasement. The Western states opposed Stalin's non-aggression pact. During World War II, there had been the Grand Alliance, in which the Americans and British worked together for the common short-term goal of defeating Hitler. During the war years, Stalin could never understand why Britain and France took so long to open a second front in France. He felt delays in mounting D-Day were politically motivated. Then there was the fate of post-war Europe, especially those areas liberated by American or Russian armies. What would happen to them after the war? That was the question. And despite wartime conferences, America, Britain, and Russia held different visions for these areas. The areas liberated by American and British armies would be heavily influenced by those governments. Soviet interests prevailed in areas liberated by the Red Army in Eastern Europe. They supported the creation of communist governments and closed societies. Well, all of these things just added to the post-war tensions, and in the end, different interests and goals drove them apart, and they became rivals. Right after the war, the U.S. and Britain talked about establishing free enterprise economies and democratic governments everywhere. Stalin, though, said never again. In fact, before the war was even over, in February of 1945, a conference was held at Yalta, the Yalta Conference. By this point in time, it was clear that Germany had lost the war. It was just a matter of time to make it official. And so Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, Franklin Roosevelt, our president, and Stalin met at Yalta to discuss the fate of post-war Europe. And it was here that they disagreed, that Stalin realized that Britain and America had different goals than he did. And I think this picture is interesting if you look at it. Look at the body language of these guys. Roosevelt and Churchill, they're somewhat relaxed, they're chatting. And then there's Stalin, removed from what's going on. Shortly after VE Day, shortly after the war in Europe ended, we have another conference, the Potsdam Conference. Now, by this point, the war's been over for nearly 2 months, and elections had been held in Britain. Winston Churchill was voted out of office, no longer Prime Minister. Clement Attlee was the new Prime Minister. And so he represented Britain at the Potsdam Conference. And you might wonder why Churchill was voted out of office. Well, he was very popular with the people. He was a hero to many. He brought this country through the war. But that was the problem. A lot of people associated him with war, and the British people wanted to move on. And so Clement Attlee is the Prime Minister. Our president, President Roosevelt, had passed away, and so Vice President Harry Truman became president. And then you have Stalin. And again, notice the body language. Well, it was at this conference that Stalin's insecurity and anxiety really flared up. If you recall from when we talked about him, I mentioned that he was a really paranoid guy. Well, this paranoia is in full force here at this conference because it's here that they discussed dropping the atomic bomb on Japan. And Stalin was terrified that we had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. It really scared him. He believed that national security for his country meant establishing some kind of pro-Soviet political control. Also, Russia had sustained 100 times more casualties in the war than had the United States. And this also just kind of fed into his fear, his anxiety. And when we dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin's sense of Russia's insecurity was just heightened. In March 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill gave a speech that came to be known as his Iron Curtain speech. And in it, he argued that Europe was divided by an invisible Iron Curtain running through Central and Eastern Europe. This Iron Curtain separated countries politically, economically, and in every way. The Iron Curtain became an enduring symbol of the Cold War. And here's a portion of that speech. He says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. So basically, what he's talking about is this invisible line that's drawn between the East and the West, and how over in the eastern part of Europe, you've got all these people living in what he refers to as the Soviet sphere, living under the burden of communism, is what he's talking about. And more, Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, is exerting influence over these people and these countries. And so this idea of an Iron Curtain becomes an enduring symbol of the Cold War. And I do want to point out it does not actually exist. It's a symbol. And I say this because a few years ago I had a student who said her high school history teacher insisted that she had visited the Iron Curtain and touched it. And I asked the student if her teacher was perhaps talking about the Berlin Wall. And she said no, she was adamant that it was the Iron Curtain. Well, people, it does not exist. It's a symbol. Along the way, there were a lot of misperceptions and misunderstandings. For example, Stalin was afraid that the West wanted a foothold in Eastern Europe to keep Russia surrounded and insecure. That wasn't the case. Another was that the United States and Britain were afraid that Stalin wanted to spread communism beyond the Iron Curtain. That wasn't the case either. These misunderstandings shaped Cold War practices, though. Fearing the spread of communism, the United States developed a strategy of containment. This was the idea that American resources would be mobilized to contain the speed of Soviet aggression. Part of the containment strategy, in fact the key to containment, was the Truman Doctrine in 1947, put forth by President Truman. This said that the United States would help any government threatened by communism, anytime, anywhere. As President Truman said, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. So basically, he's saying that we're going to use our resources to help people who are being threatened, to help people whose government is being threatened. This policy would guide the United States for decades. Where there are people whose freedom is being threatened, the idea is we will be there. And so it's going to guide us for decades. We will become involved in conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict, and others because of this policy, because we believed it was our mission to help other people. Post-war hunger and poverty made Western European lands fertile ground for communist ideas. So, to strengthen democratic governments, the United States offered a massive aid package called the Marshall Plan. And this was in 1947 also. This is also part of the containment strategy. This was a plan by which the United States would provide economic and financial aid, mainly to Western Europe, in order to promote economic cooperation and to facilitate economic recovery. Food and economic assistance were funneled into Europe to help these countries rebuild. It was successful. The Marshall Plan was good for business and contributed to Europe's astonishing recovery following the war. It translated to social stability, and it was hoped that it would revitalize economies. It succeeded in this, as well as in rejuvenating many Western European democracies and reducing the communist threat. And if you look at this picture, this map, you'll see the various countries that were helped, and you can get an idea of the amount of aid that was given. So how did Stalin react to this? What was his response to containment? Well, he didn't like it. He saw it as an offensive strategy directed against Russia. Because containment made Stalin so nervous, and because he saw it as an offensive strategy directed against his country, he decided to Stalinize Eastern Europe. And so from 1947 until his death in 1953, he tried to tighten Russian political controls over Eastern European countries. Stalinizing the bloc meant using secret police and whatever was available to achieve these ends. And you can see on this map these countries in the pink. These are Eastern European countries that were liberated at the end of the war by the Russians. And so the Russians maintained control over them politically and militarily. And when Stalin begins Stalinizing the bloc, that just refers to him, as I said, tightening Russian controls over those Eastern European countries. And they were sometimes referred to as the Eastern Bloc countries. One exception to Stalinizing was Yugoslavia. It was led by a strong-minded and popular communist leader named Tito. He was able to resist Stalinization and protect his country. He created his own version of national communism. Tito had more leverage than other leaders in dealing with Russia, and this is because he had liberated his own country at the end of the war, and he had popular support. The people were behind him. Geography also helped, because much of the border of Yugoslavia, and you can see it on this map at the right, much of the border of Yugoslavia was mountainous, and these mountains protected Yugoslavia from an invasion by the Red Army. So Stalin is not able to gain control of Yugoslavia. He's not happy. So he compensates in Germany. His resentment of Western moves to rebuild Germany triggered a crisis over the city of Berlin. The Allies had agreed that Germany would be occupied by the United States, Britain, and the Soviets. They would all maintain forces. France also was given an area. You can see by this map that Germany was divided basically into 4 zones: the British zone, the Soviet, the American, and the French zone there in the west. France was actually given territory that it had lost to Hitler, territory that had been part of their country, and then they lost it to Germany. Now, the countries had differing visions for Germany. Stalin wanted to keep Germany weak, divided, and neutral under foreign military occupation. The United States and Britain, on the other hand, wanted to rebuild and revive the devastation left by the war. And the key issue becomes the status of the city of Berlin. This city was located in East Germany, which was the Soviet zone of occupation. It was agreed that Berlin was to be occupied jointly by Americans, Brits, and Soviets. Stalin did not like this at all. And here you see a photograph of the city of Berlin, a portion of it, taken in 1948. And you see people in the British zone, and then you see over on the other side the Soviet sector. And I want to add, too, the fact that these countries are occupying Germany. That's why today they're, like America, for example, has military bases over in Germany and other parts of Europe. That started here at the end of World War II when we're occupying these areas. Well, Stalin, like I said, he's not happy that the Americans and the Brits are also in Berlin. So in 1948, he ordered a blockade of the American and British sectors. He cut off all communication and transportation ties, hoping to push the United States and Britain out of Berlin. And so it meant that these people living in these sectors, they're trapped. No supplies coming in. They can't leave. The result was the Berlin Airlift, a massive airlift of food and supplies to the people trapped there in Berlin. And this started in 1948 when the blockade went up, and it went into 1949. And it worked. The people who were trapped were given the supplies they needed, and in the end, Stalin backed off. But the blockade and then the Berlin airlift just accelerated the split between the two sides. The result was a Germany divided. In the West, there was the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, based in Bonn, with a parliamentary democracy. In the East, there was the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, based in Berlin, with a communist dictatorship. So Germany remained divided, and this convinced the United States and its allies to form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is formed in 1949, and its purpose was to contain the spread of communism and provide security for the rest of Europe. And you can see by looking at this map, all those areas in gold are the NATO countries working together. But it made the Soviets nervous. And so in 1955, NATO was countered with the Warsaw Pact. This was an alliance that connected Eastern European communist countries with Russia. And so basically the Warsaw Pact was just the communist version of NATO. And you can see on this map the orangey countries. Those are Warsaw Pact members. So the Cold War becomes a struggle over economic, political, and ideological influence. By the 1950s, both sides saw escalating military budgets as they're funneling more and more of their resources into building up their arsenals because you don't know what the other side is planning. Both sides grasped the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, and there was the continued threat of mutually assured destruction. This is the period where we have the Red Scare in the United States, where there was this huge fear of the spread of communism. A lot of people had bomb shelters, which they built to prepare for the possibility of a nuclear disaster or nuclear attack. This is when we see paranoia within the government and Hollywood and other places where there was the fear of communists or Reds infiltrating. And this is going on in other places as well. Albert Einstein had made a prophecy. He had said, if World War III is a nuclear war, then World War IV will be fought with stones, meaning we'll destroy ourselves. And that's what a lot of people feared during this time. It was a tragedy that the Cold War lasted for so long. And it was a tragedy, too, because the Soviet Union and the United States became enemies everywhere. In Asia, anywhere around the world where they had a foothold. And we see, for example, conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict. These were fights, basically communism versus democracy. You've got the democracies, the United States, in some cases Britain, and others supporting those people fighting for their independence and freedom. And then you've got communist nations like China, the Soviet Union, supporting those fighting for communist regimes. In fact, trying to help them implement those regimes. And the rivalry fluctuated from episodes of crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, to episodes of dialogue and just trying to get along. It's also during this time, as part of this rivalry, that we see the space race beginning. You see the United States and the Soviet Union competing with one another to see, who can get the first ship up in space, who can get the first man in space, who can reach the moon first, and so forth. Throughout the 1950s, millions of people left the East and traveled over to the West. And obviously, the Soviets weren't happy with this. And so, in 1961, they built the Berlin Wall, a concrete and barbed wire barrier, a physical manifestation of this separation between democracy and communism. It divided the city of Berlin, and all along the wall were stationed soldiers who had orders to shoot, because the goal was to keep people over in the east, on the eastern or in the eastern side, in the communist sector. Now, imagine you're living there. This wall goes up, and maybe you have family over in the other part of the city, other part of the country. Well, it's now a separate country, West Germany. You're not going to see them again. You lose contact with them because these communist countries were isolated from the outside world. Now, that's not to say that no one is going to try to get out. There were many people who tried. Many people died trying. I read about one family who actually spent a year building a hot air balloon in their basement, and they waited for just the right weather conditions. And there's one particular night, it was really, really foggy. The moon was covered by clouds, so there was not any natural light. They inflated the balloon, loaded themselves up along with their family dog, and sailed over the wall. And they were spotted actually just as they were sailing over the wall, and shots were fired, but they did make it to the other side. This was not the norm, unfortunately. In the 1970s, détente was reached. This was a period of relaxed tensions. There were arms agreements and efforts to reduce the arsenals. There were trade networks established, some communication. Détente brought new agreements to reduce nuclear stockpiles. And détente is important because it provided a foundation for the ultimate end of the Cold War. It was with Mikhail Gorbachev that we finally see an end to the Cold War, thanks to his reform movements. And I'm going to talk more in depth about him in the next lecture, but he was elected president of the Soviet Union in 1945, and he loosened the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe. One after another, communist governments collapsed, setting the stage for the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union itself. One thing he did was issue reforms, and two of his major reforms were perestroika, which was a reform of political and economic institutions, and glasnost, which meant openness, which was a really new idea in a society that was known for being closed off. And all of this culminates in 1989, the Year of Truth. It was during this year that we see a domino effect. Gorbachev starts these reforms in the Soviet Union. He loosens the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe. And it's just a domino effect as one by one these Eastern European countries declare their independence, establish new democratic governments. And what you see in this picture is the Berlin Wall coming down. You see people from the East greeting people from the West. And ultimately what this is going to do is cause all these communist governments to collapse, setting the stage for the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In 1945, when World War II ended, the world hoped for an end to decades of economic crisis, bloody dictators, and savage war. Instead, it faced new tensions. The Cold War lasted for more than 40 years. Rivalry between the hostile camps would not only divide Europe, but would also fuel crises around the world. It would drain the resources of the United States, and exhaust those of the Soviet Union. It would not erupt into large-scale fighting between the two superpowers, but as I said earlier, many small wars broke out, with the superpowers championing opposite sides. Meanwhile, the spread of ominous new weapons would more than once raise the specter of global destruction. As the Cold War ended, nations in Western and Eastern Europe sought normal relations. Germany was reunited. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. NATO, originally formed to defend the West against communism, had to redefine the role in a post-war world, a post-Cold War world. And even as Europeans celebrated the end of the Cold War, new issues are going to arise. Many Eastern Europeans fled economic hardships to find work in the West. The newcomers were not always welcome. Ethnic clashes created new tensions that threatened the peace of Europe. And so even though the Cold War comes to an end, there's still going to be problems.